Los Angeles. Downtown Sports Arena, the 17th of March, 1981. Saturday evening, the kind of night that felt as if the city itself had paused to watch something improbable unfold. The arena smelled of sweat, hot metal, and cigarette smoke. A familiar perfume for places that hosted combat. The overhead lights cut through the dark like spotlights on a stage, making the ring look less like a square of rope and canvas and more like an altar. 300 people pressed into the space. Trainers who had seen champions rise and fall. Martial arts teachers who taught in the basement of cultural centers and dreamed of legitimacy. Sports writers who translated violence into headlines. Hollywood faces who had come for the story rather than the spectacle. No tickets, no cameras. Just word of mouth and a challenge that had the taste of danger on it. Muhammad Ali stood in the middle of the ring like he belonged to every square inch of it. He was the king in someone else's crown. 6'3", 210 pounds, a walking poem of muscle and motion. He rolled his shoulders, a practiced ripple of warm-up, and smiled the smile that could disarm a city. His red gloves caught the light and flashed, but it was his voice that held the room, a public instrument tuned to both taunt and charm. Bring him to me. He had said weeks earlier at a party, the words casual, theatrical. Let him hit me, let him try. It was the sort of line Ali loved, a dare wrapped in a show. Yet rumor, once it takes shape, has its own gravity. The name spread through Hollywood back alleys and dojos. Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee, who moved like water and spoke about technique as if it were philosophy. Bruce Lee, the martial artist who had come from Hong Kong and was busy remaking how Americans thought about motion and force. Bruce Lee, who was not a boxer, who did not live in the ring, who did not come with belts or trophies that fit in a trophy case. He had a reputation for speed, for precision, for a way of moving that made people lean closer to hear a quiet kind of language. The challenge took on a life. Ali's team made it public enough to be irresistible. Bruce's camp was careful, cautious, because a single public misstep could either demolish a career or dub it a miracle. They negotiated terms like men discussing a paradox. It would be private, no spectacle beyond witness. One strike, one demonstration, no defense, no cameras, no spectacle beyond the fact that two embodiments of different worlds would stand in the same square and measure themselves. On the night, the crowd did not settle into normal spectator roles. There was reverence mixed with a gossip's appetite. There was unease in the way people lingered at the edges, like one step away from something that could scorch their assumptions. Ali bounced lightly, not sparring, just moving as though the ring were a ballroom, and he were dancing. His mouth laughed and dared like a brass instrument. Bruce Lee stood opposite, smaller on paper, but with a posture that suggested contained steel. He was not preening. He did not perform. He simply breathed in a way that looked like preparation, not for show, but for what he believed he could do. They introduced themselves the way men who knew each other by reputation did. Ali with his wide grin and a voice that filled the ropes. Bruce with a quiet nod and a look that seemed to parse a man down to his weakest joint. The referee, a professional whose hands had raised champions and lowered hopefuls, explained the terms as if it were a normal arrangement. One strike, he said. Mr. Ali will not block or evade. Ali nodded with a confidence that could be felt as a force. I am sure, he said. Let him hit me. Then the ring became a stage and their breath a metronome. Ali let his arms fall. His guard dropped until it was a theatrical gesture of arrogance. He spread himself like an open book. He wanted to make a point that would be both spectacle and proof. The crowd leaned forward, the air tasting like expectation. For 3 heartbeats a silence took shape that did not belong to any ordinary fight. The ring felt suspended in some other kind of time. Bruce stepped forward without drama, closing the distance with a single movement that erased the gap between a rumor and a fact. He did not shift his hands into a fighter's pose. He did not wind up. His right hand traveled as if tracing a line in the air, a movement so minimized it was almost invisible. And then, in a breath that registered as more whispered than heard, his hand struck not with the weight of muscle, but with the authority of knowing exactly where a body yields to a single precise touch. The contact was not cinematic. There was no thunderclap, no exaggerated camera angle. It was a snap, clean and articulate, the kind of noise a focus joint makes when pressure is applied in the exact place it must surrender. The sound, to the assembled 300, was less important than the result. Ali's knees folded, not the stumble of a man knocked out by force, but the involuntary collapse of someone whose system has been momentarily intercepted. The crowd did not gasp because they had been robbed of breath. They sat stunned because they could not reconcile cause and effect. A man who had been hit by the hardest fists in the world, punches that had bent steel in men's perceptions, was on his knees from a touch that had looked like an afterthought. There are many kinds of silence. This was the silence of mutation, the silence where old rules flex and sometimes break. For 5 seconds, Ali remained on his knees, hands on the canvas, chest heaving as he wrestled with a diaphragm that had been jarred into protest. His mouth opened and there was a sound that was not a cry but a surprised recognition of something he had not expected. Vulnerability. The arena, which had hours earlier hosted routine training and practice, seemed to collect itself like a held breath. Bruce stood above him, hands at his sides, not triumphant, not vindictive. There was no preening, no gloating. There was only a calm that looked like answer to a question. He extended his hand without ceremony. Ali stared at it as if at a new proposition. When Ali took it, the world shifted. The champion rose unsteady and said words afterward that would be stored in private rooms of memory. He hit me. Not the flourish Ali might have used in public, but a quiet confession that both admitted a thing and refused to explain it away. The term martial arts meant different things to different people in that moment. To some who had been standing in scattered rows, it meant mysticism or showmanship. To others, it was a craft that demanded a mind that considered the body not as brute force but as a system of levers, nerves, and thresholds. Bruce, in that second, had demonstrated a principle that refused the tidy categories of Western sport. He had shown what happens when precision meets vulnerability. He did not need to land a wild knockout. He only needed to find the one point that undoes stability, a spot on a human map where the body says no. For a moment, news of the demonstration moved in the way truth moves through rumor. Haltingly, unevenly, magnified by envy and disbelief. Some left the arena convinced they had witnessed an anachronism, a man who had found a new vocabulary for violence and taught it to an icon. Others left muttering that Ali had staged it, that the champion had allowed the humiliation for show, that history had been put on a leash and paraded. The debate became an extra show, a chorus of testimony and allegation that turned a private moment into a public puzzle. Muhammad Ali, who had built his legend on bravado and the poetry of flinty will, did not rehearse the same story in public. To the world he offered the expected list, the names of men who hit him hardest, the heavyweights whose strikes had registered as the true measure of force. But when men sat with him in the quiet, when there was no need to perform, he would say with something that was not meant for ears beyond those present, that a small man from Hong Kong had struck him with something he could not see and had taken with it something he did not bargain to surrender. It was a confession that made the myth pliable. Why did the story explode? People are pack animals when it comes to narratives. When someone with Ali's cultural weight, a man whose every phrase ricocheted through public consciousness, is seen to falter in a way that cannot be explained by brute force alone, the mind reaches for resolution. Bruce Lee represented a different way of thinking about movement. And in one minimized gesture, he had given an entire argument a living example. The scene offered what humans crave, a mystery with an answer that refuses to sit in easy boxes. But beyond the simple mechanics of the strike, the appeal was deeper. It fed on archetypes. It put a small, steadfast craftsman against a larger than life monarch of a different craft. It offered an intimate stage to test a question old as stories: can technique outmaneuver power? The answer, in that ring that night, felt like a wound and a revelation all at once. People who wanted to see efficacy vindicated cheered quietly to themselves. Those who loved spectacle felt a thrill at watching an unexpected rhythm replace expectation. There was also the delicious black market quality of the story. This was not a televised fight with sponsors and camera angles. It was a private thing, whispered, witnessed, and therefore tainted with the sweet suspicion of conspiracy. Humans like secrets. They like the authority of being an insider. That the demonstration was supposedly witnessed by only 300 people made the whole story precious. If it was true, then you could be among the few who had experienced a shift in how humans conceive force. If it wasn't true, then you owned the narrative of an exhilarating lie. To martial artists, The demonstration offered a syllable of validation. To boxers, it opened a wound of doubt. Each community used the event to tell itself a story about its own identity. Fans argued about whether a single strike could decide anything in a sport predicated on rounds and endurance. Practitioners in training halls argued about the ethics and reality of such a demonstration. The story multiplied because it asked everyone to choose an allegiance. And once people choose, they tend to shout their choice so the world will hear. Over the years, the tale collected accretions. Some recast the blow as a myth of the new century, an urban legend that confirmed what its devotees wanted to be true. Others tried to dismantle it with rational analysis. The strike, they argued, based on mechanics and physiology, could induce a diaphragmatic spasm or trigger a neural reflex that would temporarily incapacitate a man, even one of Ali's caliber. The technical explanations offered a sterile counterpoint to the romance of the event. But romance is a persistent noise. It survives in the way people tell it to each other across decades, in the hush when a narrator leans forward and says, "You remember the time." There is another reason the moment lodged in public imagination. It was a human story about humility. Ali, the unstoppable, the man who floated and stung and declared himself the greatest, was shown in a moment of exposure. He had the grace to acknowledge what had happened without flailing into denial or bravado. He helped Bruce to his feet. He raised Bruce's hand in some accounts, a gesture of sportsmanship that complicated the narrative. In that mingling of respect and bewilderment, something like a new kind of heroism appeared. It wasn't about who was hardest. It was about who moved with the integrity to own what was true for him in that instant. The crowd outside the ring lingered for minutes that felt like hours. People clustered and argued and fought for the truth like it was their property. Journalists without cameras scribbled notes with a hunger that felt edge. Like practitioners traded theories as if reconstructing a blueprint. Hollywood types framed the scene as the blueprint of a film that would never be filmed. The moment became a prism, refracting different truths depending on the angle. In the private months that followed, Bruce retreated to his work. He did not stay to collect accolades or to milk the mystery. He kept moving, teaching, refining, talking about economy of motion and the poetry of efficiency. Ali kept fighting, kept speaking his verse into the world, but always with a small reserved chamber where that night was filed away like an odd coin. To both men, the encounter was a chunk of truth that lived outside of headlines and applause. It was something that would be told and retold, a story that grew legs and walked out into the culture. Generations who never witnessed the event learned of it the way myths are passed down, in the cadence of retelling, in the way the details get polished or dimmed. Some insisted on empirical explanations. Some invested the encounter with spiritual meaning. Others used it to construct identities: pro-boxing, pro-martial arts, pro-precision, pro-power. Each telling was a mirror held to the teller, revealing more about them than about the night itself. If you sit with the story now, decades removed from the moment, it reads as more than an incident. It becomes a parable about the shifting nature of authority. It asks us to question how we measure strength and what we accept when the world presents us with an undigestible truth. It suggests that mastery sometimes wears a small body and speaks in a small, swift gesture. It warns that size and fame are not infallible shields against precise knowledge, and there is a tenderness in how the two men handled it afterward. They did not turn the night into a crusade or a battlefield. Ali did not spend his life denying the moment. Bruce did not spend his life boasting. Each treated it as an experience and let it sit with them like a quiet traveler who had passed through. That restraint added to the myth. It made the story seem less like a publicity stunt and more like a genuine collision between philosophies. People still argue about what happened in that ring. They will argue, likely forever, because the event refuses to be pinned down by explanation alone. That is its power. It is part myth, part demonstration, part private truth that public life could not wholly consume. It exists. Now, as a story we tell each other to test how we feel about technique, power, fame, and humility. If you had been there, you would have described the moment in fragments: the smear of light on canvas, the echo of a snap, Ali's knees folding like a man learning a new grammar, Bruce's quiet posture, the crowd's stunned silence. You would remember the awkwardness of having been witness to something that seemed impossible. You would remember the way the air changed and how, after that, Every argument about what mattered in combat and in life acquired an extra stubborn footnote. Precision can unmake force, and a single true touch can rewrite what everyone thought they knew. Years later, when people say they remember the night Ali went down, it is not always about the mechanics. It is about the tremor that runs through a culture when an assumption is displaced. It is about how legends are not only created in arenas but also dismantled, briefly, by the smallest things. It is about the humility of champions and the quiet confidence of those who have practiced so long that their moves have ceased to need the eye's greeting. And so the story persists. Not because it is clean or convenient, but because it is human. It gives room for debate and for reverence. It lets people claim a side and, through that claim, define themselves. It keeps alive the moment when two masters who measured their lives in different units stood in the same square of light and asked the world to reconsider the way it tallied worth. In the end, the night belonged to a truth neither man could brand with a single word. It belonged to an encounter that refused to be tidy, and by refusing taught the world a modest lesson, that knowledge can be a weapon as precise as any fist, that mastery often whispers rather than roars, and that sometimes history hinges on a single, perfectly placed second.